Well, David, we finally made it. This is exciting.
It really is. It's taken a while to get this together, but I'm really excited about this. I'm less excited about what we've decided to call this. It's video talk, which is a bit generic, but you can't complain that it's not accurate.
It's just what it says on the tin, I think.
Yeah. Let's just explain what we're doing here. We're going to do a series of podcasts where we're talking about video technology, but most importantly, how you use it in a practical sense. And before we do our own introductions, I just want to say thanks ever so much to Blackmagic Design. It's a company that doesn't really need an introduction, except to say that if you've ever been to one of the big trade shows, you'll have noticed that their booth is about the size of an airport terminal. That's not hubris or showing off on the part of Blackmagic. It's just that they've got so many products.
And it's amazing as you here when we build up our kit, and I think in anywhere you go, you think, I haven't got much Blackmagic design product, until you take a look around and realise your adapters and all the rest
That's
of it.
it. They're not all like sexy headline grabbers, are they? Like the cameras and stuff. They make widgets and infrastructural thing that makes everything else work, and that's a huge part of their business. I don't think everybody realises that. So overall, it's an amazing company, and thanks ever so much for getting behind this, because this is a chance for us to talk about the practical side of setting up a video studio. And we're going to cover a number of topics, but this particular podcast is about setting up a low-cost TV studio. So we're going to be talking about that and what are the advantages of doing that as opposed to just filming somebody in a room in your house or something like that.
Or coffee shop or out on the street, I guess.
Yeah. So just introductions. My name is Dave Shapton. I'm the editor-in-chief of RedShark Media, and we do a number of things. We've got a publication called RedSharkNews.com. We do events, and we do things like this, all around what we describe as the moving image industry. And we're number one in that space, not least because we invented the term. So,
yes, exactly.
But it literally means anything to do with video, from filmmaking all the way to big outdoor screens. Anything to do with video technology. And of course, video technology is changing and improving all the time in a staggering way. So, Matt, I'll let you introduce yourself and what your background is.
Yep. Well, I'm Mat Cooper. I'm an occasional RedShark contributor, and you may have seen me around on various videos online and, all over the place. But in my day job, we run a studio here in the middle of England where we do all studio-related activities. So things like this, bigger shows, smaller shows, helping bits of production on, say, an insert for broadcast, or whatever it might be where you want consistent and controlled environments. And part of that means that we have to carry all of the kit and support in order to make that happen. That's really where my introduction to Blackmagic and lots of other camera manufacturers and equipment manufacturers comes in. But for the purposes of this, we're talking through lots of the different steps that you can take to create a TV studio. And I mean, in my mind, we're both familiar with the big, sexy, glossy television studio where it's millions of pounds worth of equipment. But it doesn't have to be that way. And part of what we're showing today and part of what we're going to discuss through is, can you do that if you are just starting out? And we think you can here.
Yeah. I think it's important to understand that what we're going to show you is how you can work with equipment that doesn't cost a lot. In fact, it costs staggeringly less than you might have had to pay just 10 years ago. I also want to say that what we're doing today is a video podcast. So this is not something with the production values of a TV studio. It's a radio show essentially with cameras. And so that's why you see us wearing headphones. It's why you see all sorts of gubbins all over the place. We're not trying to make this look like the most, the sort of show that CNN would put on. We're not trying to do that. It's just a way of letting you see what we're doing. And it's a great format. It's a great format because if you like podcasts, you can see it on YouTube and you can see us. And it's a different way to engage. But what we're talking about today is an actual TV studio where you do have those high production values, but it costs an awful lot less. Yeah. And to the extent that I think that you could consider setting up a studio, even for a relatively low budget production. But I think one of the things I was going to ask you about this, Matt, but it seems to me one of the reasons you might want a studio is for consistency. So if you're going to do a series of programs, it makes an awful lot of sense to have somewhere that's set up and pretty much ready to go when you turn up on the day.
You're absolutely right, David. I mean, when you come into a studio, let's say, well, let's just pick a few scenarios. Maybe you're doing a weekly show that you need to keep coming back to. Maybe you're partway through a documentary series that you need to be interviewing different contributors along the way. There may be many reasons that you can't shoot everything that you need to do in one day. Or maybe you can, but you need it to look like something that was done previously. Well, that's where a studio comes in. It should have lots of prerequisite things. So you should have a consistent finish to the space that you're in. So that means that the walls will look the same when the lights are switched on. It means the sound will be the same regardless of the weather or what's going on outside. It'll mean what you see through the camera will look the same. And if you've ever been out on a location interview, then you'll know that actually it takes quite a bit longer to set up your lighting to get the look that you're going for. In a studio, particularly a studio like this, where you have techs on hand who are also really well versed with the space and a team that absolutely understands the way that the space will react, then you should be able to pin your look every single time and never have to be going, oh, well, that didn't quite work. We need to jiggle with this.
So, and just for continuity's sake, you might have to, assuming you're not going out live, you might have to edit something. And if you do an edit and the lighting's different, it's going to be really jarring, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's more so when you move on to things like green screen studios and starting to do more specialist things. But yeah, that consistency is absolutely key.
Well, we'll come on to green screen in a bit because that's a thing in itself, isn't it?
Yes.
But so, you've got a stable, consistent environment. It's easier to make multiple programs or multiple pieces of the same program if you've got the consistent setup. It's easier to take control of quality because quality is not something that just happens, is it?
No. And I think it's a really important point to touch on because as technology's got better and better, and now you can buy really fancy 4K and beyond cameras for not a lot of money, I think that people are lured into a bit of a false sense of security that quality is just by whatever camera you shoot it with. Yeah. But as we know, look back 30, 40, 50 years, television then was great quality. And the cameras were, well, we'd laugh at them now, but the truth is that the quality isn't just there in the sensor. It's the entire environment.
It's the environment, yeah. And it goes without saying that should include the audio
Very
as well.
much so.
Often neglected, but you get the audio wrong and it's going to ruin the entire production.
Yeah. And that's where studios really come into their own. You should be able to control the audio beyond that you could in any other location.
Yeah, and if you look at, for example, how the BBC does things, there can be like a serious event that nobody was expecting, but they'll pretty much have a studio that is ready to go that they can cover it with.
Absolutely.
Let's say they want to interview some politicians or something like that. They can just throw them into an existing studio and you just know it's going to work. Now, obviously, they've got the advantage that they have like a million studios and they've got all those lights that you see up in the ceiling and it's pretty much ready to go. Although they would disagree with that. They'd say there's still a lot of setting up to do. But nevertheless, they can reach full broadcast quality in a very short time, unexpectedly. Yeah. So if you have the ability, if you've got a building or something like that, to have a studio in it, it gives you a huge advantage if there's a sort of late breaking event that you want to cover with talking heads or a mixture of presenter and maybe some graphics, green screen graphics around you. I just want to ask you about what are the basics? Well, let's say you've got an empty room and you want to build a studio in it. What are the basics around that?
Well, that's a very good question, because in truth, any or many spaces could be studios, and indeed many spaces are studios. So the building that we're in now, believe it or not, was actually a heating and plumbing supplies place once upon a time.
Yeah,
so
I knew that.
It wasn't built as a studio,
No.
but it serves purpose as a studio, and with a little bit of work, it became what it is now. Now, in a studio, you're looking for a number of things depending on what it is you want to do. Now, this particular studio, we want to be able to do whatever any of our clients or customers would like to do. So we're looking for consistency in the whole space. And for us, that means consistency of finish across the walls. So in our studio here, but in many other studios, you'll see an infinity cove whereby in whatever direction you point the camera, you're going to get, providing there's nothing in front of the camera, you will get a very consistent image.
And I just want to mention that if you're looking at this on YouTube, this is not the studio.
No.
Just to clarify, we're making this in the equivalent of a cupboard, but the actual studio Matt's referring to is next door, and it's a fully fledged, really nice studio.
Yeah. So, but what we're looking for is at every step of the way is consistency. So if we point a camera in a certain direction, is it going to look the same as if we turn the camera around the other way? Well, it does. And the reason it does is because let's say we were going into an office space, we'd want the walls to all be the same colour and of the same tone.
Yeah.
And then able to receive light in the same way. So then a big studio would have fairly expensive lights and a lot of them to give you that consistent finish on the wall. But you can do it with less expensive ways as well. But you're looking for, again, consistency. In our studio, we're looking for a totally flat floor. So if we want to roll cameras around on pedestals, they can do that without jumping up and down. Again, if you go into a bedroom or an office or something where there's carpet on the floor, that may present you with some challenges.
Yeah.
So you're looking for a pretty hard room. Then enters the final problem that you've got is, as you mentioned earlier, audio. Now, sound is one of the trickiest things to get right in a studio that you've made look really good, because you probably end up with a lot of hard walls and...
Yeah, you've got conflicting aspects to that. A perfect studio for sound wouldn't look very good.
No, it would look terrible, in fact. And generally, hard things will bounce the sound off of them and you'll get echoes. And it's a little bit echoey in this room, but it's not a particular...
So the way around that, if you possibly can, is to talk close to the mic.
That is certainly one way around it. But obviously, if you're creating a studio that you want to be able to do lots of different things, then you're going to want a little bit more flexibility. So having a look into soundproofing panels, or in our case, we have a false ceiling, which is about a foot thick with soundproof on, and that really helps the acoustics in the room. As you mentioned earlier about the audio, really, no matter how good the video aspect is, without the audio, it will always look amateurish. So sound is really critical and often overlooked when people are starting to build
and
a studio.
I found, talking to a lot of dubbing mixers and people who work in audio post-production, they have two things that must be right. The first thing is, yes, the overall sound must be really good in the sense of not having too much in the way of reflections and obviously background noise, air conditioning, stuff like that. But the other thing, which is partly a consequence of the first thing, is intelligibility. People hate it if they can't hear or understand what people are saying. And it's very easy to lose intelligibility if you're just a bit too far back from the mic, if there's other stuff going on. I don't know if you remember, if you saw recently the film Interstellar.
Yes, yeah.
And who was the main guy in that?
Matthew McConaughey.
Exactly, yeah.
Who's a bit mumbly by nature.
He is, yeah. He says things like, "We've got to get off this planet."
Oh, very good.
Yeah, and I watched that on a plane once across the Atlantic on a horrible 9-inch screen against my better judgment. And you know what? I spent the whole film not understanding a word that he said.
Right.
Because you've got this, effectively, you've got the sound of like 100 vacuum cleaners going on when you're on a plane. And I could hear his voice, but I could not understand what he was saying. So this is really important. and we keep stressing this, not just because, like, aesthetically it's nicer to have sound that sounds good. It's because your whole production will be ruined if it's not right.
You're absolutely right. And we're delving into it a bit more than maybe people would expect, because most of the great articles on RedShark are about the video. Most of the things that people pick up the phone to talk to us about are about the cameras, the lenses, the sexy stuff. And then audio does get overlooked. And as you say, without the audio, well, we're all wasting our time.
Yeah. So sorry to labour that point, but it's necessary. It's necessary. So when you got your basics, and we haven't really covered equipment yet, but we'll come back to that. When you've got the basics of your empty room that's becoming a studio, how do you make it look good? And I guess there are two ways you can do that. Correct me if I'm wrong. There are two fundamental ways you can do that. You can design a set, or you can have a green screen.
Yes.
Or some combination of the two.
Exactly. That's basically it. I would subdivide the building a set into building a set and all practical lighting. I think lighting is, much like we've been banging on about audio, we could do another 3 or 4 podcasts just on lighting.
Yeah.
But
do you want to just explain what you mean by practical lighting? Because that's got a specific meaning, hasn't it?
So when... if you imagine these, do you remember these sort of cardboard cutout puppet shows that you would have when you were a child? Well, those looked great to the eye, but if you actually tried to film those, your camera doesn't see in 3D like your eyes do. Yeah. So everything is going to, assuming all things equal, when something is lit evenly, it's going to look very flat. So in the case of this, maybe even on here, we may not be that discernible from the background. Well, if you're in a studio, you want to create a bit of a sense of space and where you are in the world versus anything else. And lighting is the number one way to do that. So practical lights are lights that you would have on set. So if you're listening by audio, apologies, but if you're not, you'll see a few practical lights in the background here. Now, on this particular our Broom Cupboard podcast, it's not doing a massive amount, but on a studio it will start to make all of the difference. It'll define the tone and the mood and all of
Well, you know, it's a different world, advertising, but think about those car adverts where you get like a new Audi or something like that, and you've got every little crease unfold in the shape of the car is highlighted, and if the camera zoomed out, you'd see like a long fluorescent strip of lighting that's just designed to highlight those, and it adds a sense of depth and reality to it, and it's not something that you learn overnight, is it?
No, it's you can learn. It's like skiing. You can learn the basics of it very quickly, but to perfect it, and your example there of automotive lighting, that can take many years, and is really an.
I mean, there are people who built their whole careers around that niche.
Absolutely. But as great and as obvious it looks in cars, it's equally as important if you're on a news set or a YouTube vlog platform or a couch show or a shiny floor show. It all makes a big difference. And shiny floor shows are probably a great example of how they're used best, because, and I guess it's worth explaining for those that don't know, shiny floor show would be a Britain's Got Talent, a quiz show, that sort of thing, generally because the floors are quite shiny. And the reason the floors are quite shiny is because there's such a vast amount of floor space, you don't really light up a floor. But if you've got a shiny floor, it will reflect all of the other lights that are around you, and that really enhances the effect.
Yeah, well, I didn't know that. I'd never heard that term.
Oh, well, there we go.
Fantastic. I'm glad I came. So can we just talk about green screens? Because that's a bit of a special case. And I remember I was introduced to green screens when I actually worked in Dubai for a year. And it was... I never realised how challenging it was, especially when the local people, you know, with their white robes, which always looked immaculate, but they don't half reflect a blue screen we were using at the time. So you know, you get issues like that. If you're wearing white against a brightly coloured screen, that becomes reflected, and then you find you've got little outbreaks of the TV picture on people's sleeves and things like that.
Very much so. I mean, I imagine we've all seen at some point the weather bloopers where somebody's wearing the wrong colour dress. But as you say, green is the most reflective colour that you can get. So if there's anything that can be reflected off of, then green will reflect off of it. This is particularly challenging for people with blonde hair, as you say, white dresses and things, because you get these reflections will come across, and well, as you say, it becomes very challenging. So again, lighting is very important there. Now, when we're thinking about a TV studio, about making the choice of whether to go for a practical set or whether to go green screen, that's an important consideration, because in reality, like we're in a broom cupboard here, but this, if we imagine that this is a set, our back wall is pretty close to us. It's 2.5, 3 foot away.
Yeah.
In reality, you need a much larger space if you're going to green screen, because the key here is we do see people on green screens with white dresses and blonde hair, and they look great when done well. The key is the separation. We're trying to reduce the amount of green that's going to reflect back on us, and we do that by quite simply shining lights from the backlighting. And once we are able to do that, then that will really help us with getting a good key. However, that does require us to be able to fit a light in between the subject and the green screen itself, and have a bit of distance to be able to do that. So really, if we're shooting a green screen, our subjects will be at least sort of 5 or 6 foot off of the green screen, and that would be a minimum. Here we try and keep it sort of 3 or 4 meters off to start isolating the subject from the background. And that, I think, touches on probably the most important principle of green screen is, and in lighting in general, but we're not looking to light everything with a few lights. We light the background independently to the subject. And really, particularly in a studio environment, the two lighting schemes never meet each other. So we want some light on the green, because if it's dark, it won't be green, it'll be black, and we won't be able to key it out. So we'll light that without any subject in there at all. And that will be lit, checked on camera for a lovely even green fill. If it's not even, we'll move some lights around, probably use some diffusion. And then after that, as a separate task altogether, we will light the subject, mindful of shadows and things that we might cast on the background, but they will be absolutely independently lit, much as if they would be if they were on a practical set.
Now, all of that sounds like a lot of work, and understandably so. But that underlines the point, doesn't it, of why you should have a studio? Because obviously, once you've set that up, you can pretty much leave it alone. Yes. And the next time you come back, it's all there. You just turn the lights on, and hopefully it's just going to behave nicely, and you'll get a good image. Because, I mean, there are incredible advantages to using a green screen.
Yes, absolutely.
You can appear to be anywhere in the world. You could be in a jungle. You could be on a rooftop playing a loop of, traffic going by, or the Thames or something like that. So incredible advantages. And again, the equipment is now available at astonishing prices compared to what they used to cost.
Well, absolutely. And I think the biggest advance in green screen, well, it's a number of things. The sensors on cameras are a lot better.
Yeah.
So it's a bit easier in truth, you don't need as much light to light up a green screen. So before CMOS sensors, an average, let's say 20 foot wide green wall, you'd probably be looking at putting about 5 kilowatts of lighting onto that background to get something that was good and keyable. Nowadays, with much more sensitive sensors and LED lights, we light our entire background with less than 1 kilowatt of lighting. And that makes a really big difference. It's a lot simpler process than it used to be, but the principles haven't changed. We're still looking to find a defined edge between something. Well, let's imagine we're cutting it out in Photoshop. We're looking for a good edge to be able to cut the green bits out. Partner that with nowadays that things like this Blackmagic 8M television studio 4K that we've got here have onboard keyers that have improved so much that, again, they make keying, really quite simple. And the same can be said for DaVinci Resolve, Final Cut Studio.
Well, Blackmagic's got some incredible expertise now, not least because it bought Ultimat, which is the famous company that just did keying. That was their raison d'etre.
And now that forms of that technology are available within all of the ATEM consoles and within DaVinci Resolve itself, these things are a lot more forgiving. However,
you've still got to get the basics.
Exactly.
Yeah, you can't do the impossible.
And I never want to sound like we're saying, we'll fix it in post. It's these things, whilst they sound scary to set up initially, once you understand the very basics, and all we're talking about here is a very basic 3-point lighting setup with a wash on the background. And for those that aren't familiar with 3-point lighting, we won't get into it here, but a cursory Google search or YouTube search will show you how that works. And everything else then is a variant of that.
I think there's another point here which is very easily lost in all the noise, which is simply that you should allow yourself time. It always takes longer to set things up than you think. And I'm just thinking about last year, I did a series of live streams, and we always thought we had loads of time, but you would be amazed at how many times we were like 5 minutes before going live, and we had to because we'd advertised it. This was like a proper live broadcast. You'd be amazed at the number of times it was like, we're going to have to change that microphone. We're going to have to put that through another channel, or if it can happen, it will happen. So allow yourself time, and that will then give you what is essentially a luxury, that everything is set up and working. And it actually makes it far more relaxing because, on low budgets, you'll have like the presenters going to be an engineer, going to be doing engineering as well, and, making the tea and going down the road to get some sandwiches. Everybody does everything. So if you can get the technical stuff all working, I think even just psychologically, it means you could be much more relaxed about what is actually typically quite a stressful thing anyway, doing a live broadcast. So just allow yourself time. It's obvious and it's not always possible, but if it is, you should certainly do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that's a really interesting thing to touch on, because you've done this type of setup before, not in a studio. And whilst this isn't a studio, it is a controlled environment.
Yeah.
So what were the challenges that you had when you were last doing your live stream events that you think will have solved by coming into a slightly more studio-ish environment?
Well, we actually did these live shows from my kitchen, which sounds absurd, but it's a nice room. It's about 25 foot square, and it's got a wall of glass down one side, and the sort of the background. If you had a bit of nice bokeh, I was out of focus background on the garden, which was just a nice, cheerful blur. It was a beautiful background. So we had every reason to do it there. But because it was like a kitchen, we had to set everything up and then take everything apart when we finished. And while we did it faster, the more episodes we did, it was there was always a chance that you'd plug something in the wrong socket, or something wouldn't be synchronized with something else, because you had all the complexity of a studio that you had to build every time. So if you have to do that, then fine, but I certainly wouldn't recommend it. And what I would recommend is finding a space where you don't have to do that, because it used to take us 3 days. It used to take us a day to set it up, a day for the actual show, and then pretty much at least half a day to take it all down again. So incredibly bad use of time, but a very useful lesson to learn.
And you had to have takeaways for the whole time, I'd imagine, with your kitchen out of action.
Constantly, yeah. Let's just start talking about equipment. This is a really big subject, and we're not going to cover everything in this podcast, in this episode. We'll come back to this. We'll circle back to this again, because there's so much to talk about. But just to do this methodically, let's talk about cameras first of all, because when people think about studios, they think of these massively expensive studio cameras on dollies, and the lenses about the size of a fridge freezer on the front. And that's a great way to do it. But how can we go to the opposite end of the scale and still get a good result? What sort of cameras do we need?
Well, there are a reason why these big expensive cameras are being used. particularly when you're seeing them, let's say BBC News or Sky News. Those cameras are in service, powered up all day, every day, never switched off. They have to be ready to go at a moment's notice for breaking news. They have to be really reliable, and there is a lot of operators with the shifts that they run at these big places to come in and out and use them regularly. So you don't see little dip switches and things that we're used to on normal cameras. These things are much more robust. And there are some technologies in there that we won't find in as we come down the price point. However, the basics of what we actually want to achieve with a studio, one would assume, is a nice product on the viewer's screen at the end of the day. And as we alluded to earlier, cameras, whilst they're getting better and better, we're not seeing these 4K plus cameras in television studios. We're seeing the majority being 1080, 2K, and some of them are being 4K. They're not going beyond that. We're not seeing the dynamic ranges that are talked about by vloggers and bloggers the world over. We're not seeing recording bit rates because none of that is important.
Essentially, most of them are working in what's called Rec 709,
yes,
anyway, aren't they? Which is a remarkably limited dynamic range. It's about, 6.5, 7 stops?
That's right, yeah.
HDR starts at about, 10 stops and goes... Cameras can easily, these days, go up to 13, 14, 15 stops. Yeah. But you don't need it for a typical TV show.
No, and indeed, there's probably nothing to be gained by having it if you really wanted to spend all that money. Yes, going to Rec 2020 now would be advantageous to some people, but let's be honest, in the last 20 years, you haven't been able to buy a camera that won't shoot a minimum of 9 stops of dynamic range.
Yes.
So then if we then think about, well, what do we need? Well, a lot of cameras that you can buy off the shelf are limited in lots of different ways, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by the technology of the day. But really, we may be making a decision to say, well, we're not bothered about the recording on the cameras. So if we think about a standard studio setup, that would be... Well, take here, we've got 3 cameras. You've got a camera, I've got a camera, and we've got this wide camera. So this is a fairly typical, basic studio setup. We don't have 3 camera operators there because, well, it gets very expensive then. And if you want to record a show, let's say we're starting out, we need a lot of people behind these cameras to make it all work. So we will want to feed all of these cameras, bypass any of the onboard recording and all the expensive things that you pay for, and come into a device like this. Now, this is a Vision Mixer. This particular one is the Blackmagic Design 8M Television Studio 4K, which I love how snappy that title is.
Yeah. Trips off the tongue.
But essentially, all of the camera feeds come into here that all we're looking to do is switch between them, which is effectively editing on the go. Now, that being the case, that gives us many, many more options straight away. So a lot of cameras, like you've got a Sony F3 right next to you there. Now that camera is probably 12 years old now.
And how much was that when that came out?
Oh, a lot. Yeah. It was a lot of money. But the truth is that camera now, they're readily available on eBay for less than £1,000. But if we look at why that's not a great camera to be using for your next feature film, it's because the onboard compression is pretty old-fashioned. It tops out at 35 megabits.
There's no RAW.
No, there's no RAW.
But when this came out, nobody would have known what to do with RAW.
Well, no.
There was no workflow.
No, exactly. And in fact, Panasonic had a go at trying to get somewhere near to RAW at the time, and it was too unwieldy. So the Sony, that camera was fantastic in its day, but it's old now. But that's not to say the image isn't great, because it is. That's a Super 35 camera, which will take cinema lenses, costs next to nothing, and we're not interested in any of the processing that's going on inside the camera.
You just take the SDI out and put it into this switcher.
You've got it. That's it. So we've got a full 1080p feed, as good as any coming into here.
Yeah. So this is the thing, and of course, there's nothing wrong with buying new cameras. They're totally, that's okay. But it may be that you get more functionality by spending your budget on a good switcher, and the audio. So I think it's because the camera is the sexy thing up front, people tend to spend too much on the cameras and then leave very little for the rest of the studio. And so ultimately your productions are going to suffer. I just want to say something about this Blackmagic Blackmagic switcher here, which is that it has essentially a scaler on every input. So you can plug virtually anything into this desk, and it will be quite happy with it, and it will turn it into a kind of unified output. In the old days, in the days of analog, and I haven't done much of this stuff, but I have gone along to a few productions, and I was amazed when I went to, it's got to be about 20 years ago, and it was all analog, obviously. And then the setting up, just to have like a 2-camera shoot, there was all the synchronizing and the timing and the color, and honestly, it was more like a science experiment. Yeah. And yet they had to go through this every time. And now the amount of that stuff that you don't have to go through now because of equipment like this, you don't have to synchronize the cameras together. No. You don't even have to have the same resolution or the same raster size coming out of them.
No, absolutely, and you're absolutely right. And what you touched on a bit earlier about why are we looking at cheaper cameras? It is so we can prioritize correctly going forward. And this unit having scalers on, just in case people are unfamiliar, on most vision mixers you would have to have cameras that are all the same. So if you want to choose a Blackmagic Ursa broadcast, they have to all be on the same settings, and every camera that you use would have to be at least the same frame size and frame rate.
Yes.
With the scaler, that enables us to plug in GoPros, which would be fantastic for lots of things. If we had a GoPro up top here looking down at the equipment, save me explaining it. And we can plug in almost anything. What we will end up with, as you alluded to, was this unified signal. But what that means is we can decide where the priority is in our studio environment. Yeah. And my suggestion for people to be thinking about would be that the vision mixer is the most valuable piece of equipment that you can buy, second only to the audio mixer.
Yeah.
And on this particular setup here, we have which is a pretty basic but very strong 8M4K mixer here, partnered with the Rode Podcaster audio mixer. And these two setups together cost less than buying one new camera.
And when you say, you're right, say it's basic in comparison to those huge science fiction like switches that you see in big TV channels, but they do everything that you would need. They do everything that you would need unless you're CNN.
Yes.
Basically. Or you've got a really complicated, sophisticated multi-camera production. And I think there's a sort of cognitive bias here, which is it's the same thing as why people say, computers aren't getting faster anymore because my 7-year-old MacBook still does everything I need it to. And that's actually wrong, because computers are getting faster, maybe not in terms of their clock speed, but when you look at the GPUs and all of this stuff that goes on, they're actually massively more capable now. But people don't perceive that because the level of computing they need to achieve their day-to-day word processing, email, Facebook browsing, that can be done on a 7-year-old computer. But if you tried like some serious rendering or heavy-duty stuff, it's analogous to why a little Fiat Punto is okay for going to the shops, but you wouldn't want to drive it around the Nürburgring.
No, exactly.
But the same thing applies to this desk, which is that it's absolutely fine for virtually anything that you'd want to do in a basic functional studio.
Well, it's probably worth just taking a quick look at what you would want to do.
Yes.
So the primary thing is to be switching between the cameras.
Yep.
And the reason we want to do that is so we're not having to do it all in post.
Yeah.
That's what we're looking for.
And that's a big time saver.
Absolutely. So, and this and pretty well, any other switcher can do that. That's where the name comes from. It's switching. It's queuing up one camera to go to the next camera to go to the next camera. Now, there's a lot of other extra functionality or extra things that you might want to do. So you touched on chroma keying earlier. You could chroma key from directly within this device. We can put still images up on the screen of products or name straps or whatever we'd like to do. We can do various other interesting things, like when we've got the right camera hardware, we could control the color and all the parameters of a camera. But if we want to go much beyond that, as you mentioned at BBC and CNN, well, that's extra hardware. It may be that you want to upgrade your mixer, but generally not because of a limitation with what the mixer can do. All mixers can mix the same way. It's not a particularly complicated process. What we're limited by on this particular mixer is having 8 camera inputs, which for our 3 camera setup is perfect. If we want to go to 32 or however many inputs we might want, then a Constellation or a 2ME or other brand.
Yeah, just imagine like you're covering the Olympics and you've got an outside broadcast truck with a switcher in it, and you've got so many feeds coming from even from different locations.
Absolutely.
And then you're going to want the kind of stratified architecture that you need. But I mean, these things are like hundreds of thousands of pounds.
Indeed.
You don't need that. If you look at what your fundamental needs are when you decide which equipment to buy.
Well, I think the one thing, and the reason I stress that so much, is because when we're thinking of cameras, we're thinking incremental gains between sensors a lot of the time, and therefore a Generation 1 Ursa is less good than a Generation 2 Ursa because the technology's got better. That doesn't really apply to switching. It either will switch or it won't switch. So therefore, even with the most basic switcher, take the new A10 Mini, it does have some limitations, but it switches as well as a £100,000 switcher. It's cutting a signal and putting another signal in place. And that's really worth understanding. Then you're just limited by your budget or your time or the space that you need to make a choice to.
So let's take that new Mini A10 as an example. I mean, something that's traditionally really expensive that comes in about the cost of an iPad Pro, if that.
It's less than that. Yeah.
And so with some, low-cost cameras or some old cameras, you've got the potential to have a studio setup, and all that money you saved you could spend on your lighting and your audio and have an astonishingly good production.
You're absolutely right. So, the limiting factors of the A10 Mini are, because they're designed for a particular market, are that instead of having SDI inputs as we have on here, which traditionally has been the standard, there's 4 HDMI inputs. So we're going the A10 Mini with 4 HDMI inputs. So if you've got 5 cameras, well, you're out of luck. But that opens it up a lot further. So a lot of the DSLRs, the GH5s, GH4s, all these types of things will plug straight in without the need for an expensive
Exactly,
SDI.
and just in case anyone's wondering, the quality of the signal you get over HDMI is in no way inferior. It's actually identical to the signal that you get over SDI. It's just that, like you're sending it by train instead of by car. It's the same stuff when it gets there. It's just a slightly different way of doing it.
Yes, absolutely. And that's it really. But again, if you wanted to, with all the different products that Blackmagic do and many other companies, adapters, so if you've got your A10 Mini and you decide, well, actually I want to borrow some better cameras or buy some better cameras, then we can adapt all of these signals because, as you say, it's the same signal coming through. But just going back to my point of investing in this stuff before that stuff, being the cameras, that will always set you on a really good path, because many people can operate a camera, or indeed, as we have here, where we've got one camera operator with locked off cameras, it's an ongoing cost saving. We've saved the money that we're using. Well, in this particular setup, we're using 2 first generation Ursa Mini Pros and an old Canon XF305. And hopefully, fingers crossed, by the time you look at this, that they will all match and look the same. Well, we've saved ourselves a significant amount of money. And when we do the next one, that saving will continue. And if we put that money in our pockets, well, we could build our own studio for this. The money racks up very quickly in the amount that you can save. But we've generated a level of consistency from start to finish. And that consistency isn't driven from the studio environment in this case, but by the base of the products that we chose to start with.
All right. Well, look, that's a good place to wrap up with possibly the most important piece of kit, the switcher. I just want to say thanks to Matt. We'll be doing this again very soon, and thanks ever so much to Blackmagic Design for their help with this, and it's very much appreciated. And we'll be back soon.
Thank you.